Greetings. Welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It's Friday, February 21st, 2025. On Fridays, we look at human behavior and justifications. Today's episode involves potential threats to democracy. Harvard professors Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt published an incredibly insightful book titled How Democracies Die in 2018. Their work involves an historical and comparative study of democracies, mainly across Europe and the Americas, and a few other exceptions as well, focusing on both the military and non-military forces that have undermined, in some cases, democracies and led to their failures over the last century. Their work casts a decidedly negative pall on the prospects of democracy in the 21st century, even in the United States moving forward. And that's the case, or they published this work well before the election of Joe Biden and then the subsequent election or re-election, I should say, of Donald Trump. So as a behavioral scientist, I'm especially intrigued by their keys to recognizing the rise of authoritarianism. It's a subject I've studied extensively myself, though mainly in the context of my lifelong study of different forms of violence and the conditions under which individuals and groups tend to radicalize and eventually, in some instances, resort to different forms of violence. I mention this because authoritarian regimes historically have been the most brutal, oppressive, and deadly regimes or forms of state-based governments in all of human history. They're the most lethal entities that human beings have ever concocted. Whether you're talking about the totalitarian regimes that have been predicated upon communism or fascism or even religious extremism. At the same time, authoritarianism doesn't simply arise in a vacuum. In fact, as Levitsky and Ziblatt convincingly demonstrate, there are several key factors that can help us identify the potential threat of the emergence of authoritarianism, even in previously healthy and reasonably stable democracies. So, hence, what I'm going to do then is share with you their four keys, the four indicators or precursors to the emergence of authoritarian regimes and the fall of democracies. So I'd like to challenge anyone who might be watching the vlog to track these indicators across key political actors and developments in your own country. And if the theory has any merit, you should be able to judge for yourselves whether or not your country's heading down an authoritarian pathway and the ultimate or projected long-term demise of democracy. Now, of course, there are some who probably don't care or mind if that happens, but that said, I'd still like to think that in terms of my own ideological biases, that most would oppose the arrival of authoritarianism on their shores. And the reason is that most people historically have been able to enjoy the highest levels of freedom and the highest quality of life for themselves, for their families, and so forth, under democratic regimes. Authoritarian and totalitarian regimes mainly benefit those in power and those who can be co-opted to support them, typically at the expense of vast swaths of their populations defined as minorities or as outcasts or as non-citizens or in the extreme as non-humans. Okay, so here are the four key indicators of authoritarian behavior and a series of questions that one could ask to evaluate whether there's growing evidence of such behavior in any specific societal context. So the first one would be rejection of or weak commitment to the democratic rules of the game. So, for example, do those who aspire to power or who have already perhaps assumed power, do they reject the Constitution of their society or express a willingness to violate or fundamentally change that Constitution? Do they suggest a need for anti-democratic measures, such as canceling elections, violating or suspending the Constitution, banning certain organizations, or restricting certain civil or political rights? Do they seek to use or condone the extra-constitutional means of changing the government, such as through military coups, through violent insurrections, or mass protests aimed at forcing a change in government? And finally, do they attempt to challenge the legitimacy of elections or undermine that legitimacy, for example, by refusing to accept credible electoral results? A second key indicator would be the denial of the legitimacy of their political opponents. So, for example, do they describe their rivals as subversive or as opposed to or a threat to the existing constitutional order? Do they claim that their rivals constitute an existential threat, either to national security or to the prevailing culture or way of life of their country? Do they baselessly describe their partisan rivals as criminals who supposedly violated the law, or their violations of the law disqualify them from full participation in the political arena? For that matter, do they also baselessly suggest that their rivals are foreign agents or secretly working in alliance or in the employment of foreign governments, usually an enemy government, or at least historically an enemy government? Or, for that matter, are they themselves working in concert with a foreign government or regime who may have an interest in overthrowing the constitutional order? The third indicator would be the toleration and or encouragement of violence. So again, you could ask about the regime in question or the peoples in question. Do they have any ties to armed groups, paramilitary forces, militias, guerrillas, or other organizations that engage in illicit violence? Or are they themselves able and willing to sponsor such violence on their own behalf? Have they or their partisan supporters and allies sponsored or encouraged mob attacks on their opponents? Have they tacitly endorsed violence by their supporters by refusing to condemn or punish such behavior, or even by pardoning those who have previously engaged in such violence? And have they praised or refused to condemn other significant acts of political violence, either in the past or elsewhere in the world? And fourth and finally, their readiness to curtail civil liberties of their opponents, including the media. Have they supported laws or policies that restrict civil liberties, such as expanded libel or defamation laws, or laws restricting protest, criticism of the government, or certain social, civic, and political organizations? Have they threatened to take legal or punitive action against their critics, whether they be from rival parties, the civil society writ large, or any types of media who may have expressed criticisms or opposed existing policies by the government? Have they, for that matter, praised the repressive measures taken by other governments, either in the past or elsewhere in the world? And are they currently expressing a desire or engaging in actual coordinated activities or even alliances with other current authoritarian regimes? And as a corollary, we might add the question as to whether or not they're currently expressing a desire or engaging in activities aimed at dismantling or weakening or somehow punishing those within the regimes or or those who were previously their allies in other parts of the world. So are they taking actions then that fundamentally undermine historically strong treaties and alliances involving other democratic regimes? So we can't predict the future then with any absolute certainty, but these four keys and their related questions are quite suggestive of where one might raise concerns about the rise of authoritarianism. Think of these as the proverbial canaries in the coal mine, a series of early warning signs. At the very least, I'd urge thoughtful persons everywhere to continue to study history and human behavior. I'd love to be wrong about authoritarianism in the 21st century. I thought that we would have learned our lessons from the 20th century and the millions of lives that were lost under authoritarian regimes, and those, by the way, including so many in the West, including in the United States and Canada and our allies who gave their lives in the cause of freedom and the maintenance of democracy and many other things. But I don't think there's any question that there's been this historic battle for the last century plus, wherein, the good guys, which I've always liked to think of ourselves and our kind, um, where we've battled against oppression and authoritarianism and totalitarianism. And we've engaged in this huge, almost global experiment in terms of the United Nations and the proclamation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the expansion of rights and the enhancement of the quality of lives of peoples all over the world. Yes, there are plenty of avenues wherein we can certainly continue to criticize the global capitalist order, but by and large, I've always thought of the West and the countries that I've been a member of, the United States and Canada, as being on the right side of history, being the good guys, the protectors of freedoms and liberties, and a bulwark against authoritarianism. So it concerns me when I see these indicators pointing in the direction of authoritarianism somehow, not only taking root, but continuing to grow and perhaps even flourish, especially in the North American context. Okay? So, I guess what I'm suggesting is that as much as I'd like to be wrong about authoritarianism in the 21st century, unfortunately, or fortunately, we know enough about human behavior that we can do a remarkably good job of predicting certain kinds of patterns and outcomes. So, for example, I stated publicly in my class on terrorism in the fall of 2023, right after Hamas had launched that horrific, deadly series of terrorist attacks on Israel back on October 7th, 2023, based on several key social scientific predictors and behavioral dynamics, I predicted that the Israelis, in response, would kill at least 10 to 20 times as many Palestinians. I made that prediction public. And I actually think I underestimated the amount of killing that result, but for reasons that I'll have to defer until another time. So let me be clear. I've never been an alarmist. I've never made outrageous predictions about the end times of humanity or assumed worst case scenarios will inevitably unfold. And that includes even with respect to climate change, where I'm deeply concerned based on the best available evidence. Instead, I'm a realist. And what that means is that I've spent decades, literally, I've committed my professional life to the study of human behavior and of history. And even my instincts are telling me now, for the first time in my lifetime, that we're experiencing a deep threat to modern democratic regimes or the modern democratic world order that's been, in place basically for the past 80 years or so. And that some of these regimes, some, of course, have already failed, but some may be entering their final stages, like a star at the end of its life exploding into a supernova. So keep this vlog on file. Let's revisit these issues periodically, or at least in the next couple of years. And as noted, I'd love to be wrong about the rise of authoritarianism and what's unfolding within the current world order. Even more to the point, my hope is that with an increased awareness and understanding of human behavior and justifications, that we can potentially preempt such an outcome. History hasn't yet been predetermined, and so there's still time. Just less time, I would argue, than we have in terms of dealing with the threat of climate change. course, nature and the earth will be just fine no matter what we do as a species. I'm just hoping that we can continue with our tremendous progress that we've made in creating democratic regimes and enhancing the quality of life of diverse peoples everywhere on the planet, so that one and all, we might be able to have the opportunity to continue to enjoy our sacred earth for generations to come. Authoritarianism, however, presents a real and imminent threat to that future. So, until next time, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives and nurture love in your hearts, and hopefully recognize authoritarianism, or at least the threat thereof, where it may be creeping up in your lives and in your societies. As ever, we have time. We can do this. We've just got to get to work. All right. We'll see you soon. Take care.